In a quiet workshop outside Syracuse, New York, an elderly collector named Walter unwraps a small bundle of oiled cloth. Inside is a knife with a black leather washer grip, a curved steel guard, and a blade shaped like a spearhead. He turns it over under the desk lamp, checking the pommel for a faint stamped mark, a bomb with flames coming off it. It is an ordinary Tuesday morning ritual for him, the same one he has done for 30 years. Clean the blade, oil the leather, check for rust, put it back in its case. He does not say a word. He does not need to. This small, unglamorous object in his hands once rode on the hip of a paratrooper jumping into Normandy in the dark. Here is the rule every army in history has followed. When you design a weapon for soldiers, you build it to survive the worst version of the job. Years of testing, refinement, committees, trials. This knife broke that rule. It was approved in a matter of weeks, built from the cheapest materials the Ordnance Corps could justify, and handed to men who had never held anything like it before. Some officers thought it was a step backward. Some soldiers said it did the job worse than the trench weapons of the previous war.
And yet, before the guns of World War II went quiet, factories across the United States had turned out more than 2.5 million of them, a number that still startles collectors and historians today. The insider fact almost nobody knows: this knife was never actually meant to be a weapon of last resort in hand-to-hand combat. It existed because of a supply chain problem nobody likes to talk about: soldiers who had no bayonet to fix and no rifle to fix it to. If stories like this, where the unwanted tool of a war becomes the mass-produced backbone of an army, pull you in, subscribe now. This channel exists to dig up the objects history almost forgot and follow them from the factory floor to the front line. To understand why this knife had to exist, you have to go back to the knife it replaced, a knuckle-guard trench dagger left over from the First World War, still sitting in American armories more than 20 years later. That older design failed the U.S. Army for two connected reasons. First, it was built for a war that no longer existed. The 1918 pattern trench knife was shaped by the static, muddy horror of the Western Front: narrow trenches, sudden ambushes, and men grappling at arm's length. By the early 1940s, warfare had changed completely. Armies moved in trucks, half-tracks, and gliders. Soldiers carried submachine guns, carbines, and radios instead of standing shoulder to shoulder in a fixed line. The old dagger, with its brass knuckle grip built for a very specific kind of trench brawl, no longer matched how men actually fought. Second, and just as urgent, it did not solve the equipment gap the Army was suddenly facing. Thousands of soldiers were now being issued the new M1 carbine, the Thompson submachine gun, and the Browning automatic rifle, none of which could mount a standard rifle bayonet. That left an enormous number of men with no fixed blade at all if their weapon ran empty or jammed at close range. The old stockpiled trench knives were too few, too outdated, and too specialized to plug that gap at the scale the Army now needed. The Army needed something new, cheap enough to mass produce, simple enough to issue to millions, and useful to men who had never been trained as knife fighters in the first place. The pressure to find a solution came to a head in December 1942, when a new prototype fighting knife, simple, spear-pointed, built around a leather washer-stacked grip, was placed in front of the civilian board of the smaller Warplants Corporation for evaluation. It was not the only design on the table.
Sitting right beside it was a rival blade, developed for the Marine Corps, the 1219C2 fighting utility knife, a knife built to double as both a weapon and a general tool, with a slightly heavier construction and a broader set of jobs it could do in the field. On paper, the Marine design looked like the smarter long-term investment. It could fight, and it could also cut rope, open crates, and handle camp chores, a knife that earned its place on a soldier's belt twice over. Several officers who had spent years thinking about close combat doctrine argued exactly that. Give the men a tool that does more, not less. But the board's decision that December came down to a colder, more industrial kind of arithmetic. Steel was rationed. Machine shop time was rationed. Skilled labor to fit tight steel-to-steel guards and double-duty blades was rationed hardest of all. The board weighed both designs against the same brutal wartime question, not which knife is better, But which knife can we build enough of, fast enough, without stealing capacity from tanks, rifles, and ammunition? The simpler, single-purpose blade won, not because it was the superior fighting tool, but because it was the one American industry could actually deliver in the numbers the war demanded. The more ambitious, do-everything design was set aside, and the leaner knife moved forward into production as the M3.
Once approved, every feature of the M3 was shaped by that same wartime logic, chosen not for elegance, but for speed of manufacture and reliability in the hands of an untrained soldier. The blade was a straight, spear-point double-edged design, roughly 6 3/4 inches long. It was chosen not because a double-edged made it deadlier in a duel, but because a symmetrical spear point could be stamped and ground on the same tooling, regardless of which hand the soldier used, cutting manufacturing steps compared to more elaborate blade profiles. The guard was a simple oval of stamped steel, bent forward slightly at the top. It was chosen not because it offered maximum hand protection in a knife fight, but because a flat stamped guard could be punched out by the thousands on existing sheet metal presses, instead of requiring the forged, fitted crossguards of the older trench dagger. The grip was built from stacked leather washers compressed onto the tang and secured with a peened pommel. It was chosen not because leather was the most durable material available, but because leather washers were cheap, could be mass-produced from scrap material, and required no complex molding or machining, unlike wood grips which needed shaping or metal grips which needed extra tooling time. The pommel carried the Ordnance Department's flaming bomb proof mark, and depending on the manufacturer, the tang was either peened over or secured with crosspins.
This was chosen not for decoration, but because it gave inspectors a fast, visible way to confirm the piece met acceptance standards across 9 different contractors, companies as varied as Camillus, Case, Imperial, Utica, and Kinfolks, all building the same knife to the same tolerances at the same time. Even the scabbard evolved along this logic. It began as a stitched leather sheath, but was later replaced with a molded, resin-impregnated fabric scabbard with a metal throat and a hinged belt loop, chosen not because leather was inferior in the field, but because leather was needed elsewhere in the war effort, and the newer material could be produced faster and held up better in wet, corrosive combat conditions. Even the false edge ground into the top few inches of the blade was a deliberate compromise. It was added not to turn the M3 into a slashing weapon, but to make the point more effective for the thrusting technique the Army actually taught its soldiers, a quick, low-cost modification to the grind rather than a redesign of the whole blade profile. Every one of these choices tells the same story. The M3 was not engineered to be the finest fighting knife ever made. It was engineered to be the fastest one to put into a million hands. By March 1943, the first M3 knives were reaching the men who needed them most, paratroopers of the airborne divisions and the newly formed Army Rangers, units built around speed, surprise, and close engagements where a rifle bayonet made no sense. Paratroopers strapped the M3 to their boots before jumping into occupied France, a habit that let them reach a blade instantly on landing, tangled in parachute lines in the dark. Rangers scaling the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc in June 1944 carried the same knife on their belts, alongside grapnel ropes and ladders. As 1943 turned into 1944, distribution widened far beyond elite units. Tank crews, machine gunners, radio operators, and Army Air Forces personnel, anyone without a rifle bayonet, began receiving the M3 as standard equipment. 9 separate American cutlery companies were now running production lines simultaneously, a level of industrial cooperation almost unheard of before the war. By August 1944, when production finally wound down, the tally stood at more than 2.5 million knives manufactured in barely a year and a half, a number that dwarfed the entire run of its World War I predecessor many times over. Its retirement came not from failure, but from evolution. Once the Army developed a purpose-built bayonet for the M1 carbine, the M4, it simply borrowed the M3's blade and grip design wholesale and mounted it onto a rifle. The M3's DNA lived on through the M4, M5, M6, and eventually the M7 bayonets that armed American soldiers through Korea and into Vietnam. Even after production stopped, the knife itself never fully left service. Surplus M3s continued to be issued and carried well past 1945, turning up decades later in the hands of soldiers fighting in Korea and again in the jungles of Vietnam. A design rushed into existence in a matter of weeks in 1943, still riding on a soldier's belt more than 20 years after the war it was built for had already ended.
Back in that quiet workshop outside Syracuse, Walter sets the knife down on a folded cloth and looks at it for a long moment before sliding it back into its case. He knows what collectors argue about, whether the M3 was ever really a great fighting knife, whether the Marine Corps design might have served troops better in the long run. He has heard both sides 100 times. But that argument, he says, misses the point of why the knife exists at all. It was never built to be the best blade a soldier could carry into a knife fight. It was built to make sure that no soldier, anywhere on the front lines of a rapidly changing war, would ever reach for his hip and find nothing there.
That is the quiet thesis sitting inside every stamped guard and every leather washer. Sometimes what wins a war is not the perfect weapon, but the one that can be put into 2.5 million hands before the enemy adapts. Walter closes the case. Somewhere in a drawer beneath his workbench sits a photograph. His own grandfather, 19 years old, grinning in an army uniform, an M3 sheathed at his boot the week before he shipped out. Walter has never used the knife for anything. He has just never been able to put it away for good.